It happens every month to roughly half the human population, and it has been happening for as long as our species has existed. Menstruation is one of the most universal human experiences, yet the history of how ancient women managed it is one of the least discussed and most surprising areas of human prehistory. The real story reaches back hundreds of thousands of years and reveals extraordinary ingenuity, cultural complexity, and a medical understanding that was in some ways more sophisticated than most people expect. Here's the first thing to understand. Menstruation in the ancient world was a fundamentally different biological experience than it is today for many women. Modern women in industrialized countries typically menstruate far more frequently than their ancient ancestors did, not because the biology has changed, but because the life circumstances have changed dramatically. A woman in a hunter-gatherer society spent most of her reproductive years either pregnant or breastfeeding. Extended breastfeeding, which can last 2 to 4 years per child and suppresses ovulation, combined with frequent pregnancies, meant that the average ancient woman may have menstruated only about 50 times in her lifetime, compared to the 400 or more cycles a typical modern woman experiences. This doesn't mean menstruation was rare, but it was a less frequent visitor, and its management was calibrated accordingly. So what did women actually use? The honest archaeological answer is that direct evidence is almost non-existent for the earliest periods of human prehistory. Organic materials, cloth, plant fibers, animal skins, and similar substances decompose rapidly and leave virtually no trace in the archaeological record. What we have instead are a combination of historical texts, ethnographic accounts of traditional societies studied in the modern era, and logical inference from what materials were available and how they were used for other purposes. The oldest and most universal solution appears to have been absorbent plant materials. Archaeological evidence from ancient Egypt, one of the earliest civilizations to leave written records about women's health, documents the use of softened papyrus as an absorbent material, a fact documented in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest known medical texts, dated to approximately 1550 BCE. Softened papyrus is remarkably absorbent and was used across multiple medical applications in ancient Egypt, suggesting its adoption for menstrual purposes followed naturally from its known absorbent properties. Across other ancient cultures, similar plant-based solutions appeared independently. In ancient Greece and Rome, there are references to women using soft wool or rags. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, mentioned wool as a menstrual material in his encyclopedic Natural History. Ancient Japanese texts from the Heian period describe women using paper fashioned into absorbent pads. In indigenous cultures across North America and Australia, documented by anthropologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries, women used softened mosses, animal skins, grasses, or carefully processed plant fibers. The specific material varied with what was locally available, but the functional approach was nearly universal, something soft, absorbent, and if possible, reusable. This is where it gets interesting, because the history of menstruation is not only a history of practical management, it is deeply embedded in the cultural and spiritual frameworks of every civilization that has ever existed. And those frameworks produced responses that range from thoughtful to extraordinary. Many ancient cultures developed specific practices, rituals, and in some cases, restrictions around menstruation. In ancient India, texts from the Vedic period describe menstruating women resting separately for several days. In many traditional cultures across Africa, the Americas, and Pacific Island societies, menstruation was considered a time of heightened spiritual power, and menstruating women were observed performing certain rituals, kept separate from certain activities or spaces, or given specific roles precisely because of the power attributed to their state. The anthropological literature on menstrual customs is vast, and while some of these customs have been interpreted by outsiders as purely restrictive, many were experienced by the women involved as periods of rest, community support, and recognized significance. The menstrual hut, documented in numerous indigenous cultures, is a good example of how context changes meaning. From one perspective, it represents exclusion. From another, it represented enforced rest from heavy labor, female community space, and the acknowledgement that what the body was doing was significant enough to deserve dedicated time and attention. Ethnographic accounts from various cultures suggest that, for many women, the menstrual retreat was neither primarily oppressive nor primarily liberating, but practically functional, a recognized pause in the relentless work of daily survival. Ancient medical traditions engaged with menstruation with a seriousness that modern people sometimes underestimate. Ancient Egyptian physicians considered regular menstruation a sign of health and documented treatments for irregular or absent cycles. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates and later Galen, wrote extensively about menstruation, its relationship to health, and approaches to supporting normal cycles. Chinese traditional medicine developed a sophisticated framework around menstrual health that included herbal treatments for pain and irregularity that are still in use in modified forms today. Ayurvedic medicine in India, likewise, developed detailed protocols around menstrual health. These ancient medical traditions varied enormously in their accuracy and their assumptions, conditions, but they shared a common recognition that menstrual health was inseparable from overall health, and that understanding it was a legitimate medical priority. Pain management is a dimension of this history that deserves specific attention. Menstrual pain, or dysmenorrhea, is a genuine physiological phenomenon affecting a significant percentage of women, and ancient medical systems tried to address it directly. Ancient Egyptian papyri recommend specific herbal preparations for menstrual pain. Greek physicians prescribed warm baths, herbal remedies, and dietary approaches. Traditional Chinese medicine developed acupuncture protocols specifically for menstrual pain. The Ebers Papyrus mentions multiple plant-based preparations. The specific remedies varied, and many would not survive scrutiny by modern pharmacology, but the underlying recognition that menstrual pain was real, medically significant, and worth treating was consistent across very different medical traditions. Here's the modern mirror. The average modern woman in an industrialized country will manage approximately 400 menstrual cycles in her lifetime, using products that became widely available only in the mid-20th century. The tampon was patented in 1933. The modern commercial pad with adhesive backing became widespread in the 1970s. Every woman who lived before those innovations, across the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence, managed her period using whatever was locally available, culturally appropriate, and personally workable. The ingenuity required to do this repeatedly across varying environments, lifestyles, and cultural contexts, while simultaneously managing pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, and the full demands of ancient daily life, is something that almost never appears in the history books. But it happened every month to every woman who ever lived, and the solutions they developed were exactly as creative and practical as everything else those women did to navigate the world without the tools we now take for granted. It happens every month to roughly half the human population, and it has been happening for as long as our species has existed. Now you know a little more about how the women who came before you handled it.